want to say that we at the partnership, and we do our work in the context of creating communities of opportunity. And by that, I mean a community in which there are rental and home ownership houses that line safe streets. Those houses are attractive, sustainable, and affordable. The adults in those houses get up and go to work every day, and they earn wages that enable them to meet the needs of their people that love them and they love them. The children have an opportunity to go to strong performing public schools, no matter their zip code. The houses, the jobs are connected by transit. There's access to healthcare, there's access to healthy foods. And interwoven in all of this is a rich tapestry of historical, recreational, cultural amenities that are accessible and affordable to all. That's what a community of opportunity looks like. A community of opportunity is one in which the circumstances of one's birth do not irrevocably set the trajectory of one's life. We live in a community where two neighborhoods are separated by 5.7 miles. Gilpin and Westover Hills, and the life expectancy is 20 years difference. 5.7 miles, 20 years difference in life expectancy. That's not a community of opportunity, but we know where we need to head. And what I used to talk about housing as just part of this, right? But I have come to believe that it's foundational. In his book, Evicted, if you've not read it, it's one of the most powerful reads you can undertake. In Evicted, Matthew Desmond says, without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. And I believe that's true. If you do not know where you're going to put your head at night, you cannot be a productive worker. If a child moves 3 or 4 times during a school year because mom or dad or both have to stay a step ahead of an eviction, whether that eviction is legitimate or not, that's not the argument, that child cannot have the best educational experience. And so we need to address the affordable housing challenges so people have a fighting chance vocationally, educationally, and then an opportunity in life. So that's the work we're doing. Just to give you an idea of real time, what our efforts are. A few years ago, the partnership established the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. I have the privilege of serving as the chair of that board. The difference between a land trust, land bank, and other affordable housing efforts is whether typically in affordable housing, you build a housing unit, for example, a house up in Churchill, and it's affordable to that family that gets to move in first, but it's affordable once and only once. With the land trust model, the land trust owns the land under the house, and the client owns the house, but when the client goes to sell, there's a revenue share model, and the cost of the land is backed out. So that house is affordable not just for the first family, but for the next and the next and the next. So you may have 100 units, but over 30 years, you've helped several hundred families. That's what a land trust is about. We serve as the land bank for Henrico, Chesterfield, and the city of Richmond. So we're working on that. We are working with each of the jurisdictions to establish accessory dwelling unit ordinances, which should be something of interest to you all. That's just you have a house, and then whether it's attached or it's detached out back of the house, you could have like what some people call a granny flat. You could convert your cottage or your garage to another apartment or living unit. Typically, the owner can live in the smaller unit or the primary unit, but needs to live on premises. But it's a way for, we think, seniors to age in place more safely. If they so desire, it's a way to create some affordable units in the city and in the counties. And we'd like to create an ordinance that allows that by right in many areas of the community. We are working, as I said, on affordable dwelling unit ordinances. The state home builders went to the General Assembly and created a legislation that is effective July 1st, which gives local governments kind of a menu of incentives to encourage private developers, particularly of multifamily, of apartments, to, if you're going to build 100 apartments, if you were to build 15 of those that were set aside as affordable below market rate, you might get a density bonus, you might get a parking waiver, you might get fast track approval. So those are some of the incentives that we'll be talking to local governments about. We have just been awarded a grant from Chesterfield to do a study with them of their older shopping centers, strip shopping centers, because what do shopping centers have? They have what apartments need. They have parking and they have utilities. And so instead of having half vacant strip malls that have code issues, why not turn that into mixed use, mixed income communities that create more affordable housing for everyone. Again, we are working very quickly. We believe one of the solutions in the framework is the creation of what was called originally a regional homeownership center. We have turned that into a regional housing resource line, where we will have 2 people on staff who are taking calls in from the community. Right now we have a very robust homeless crisis hotline. Unfortunately, it only serves people who are within 3 days of homelessness. So if you're within 14 days of not being able to pay your rent, if you were to call the homeless crisis hotline, they would say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive. I know that most people who are within 14 days of not being able to pay the rent and would be concerned and looking for assistance, but we have so much need in terms of people truly facing homelessness that we have to turn people away until they are really on the cusp of being unsheltered. So we want to set up a housing resource line that will be staffed. We'll have this set up by Labor Day, if not sooner. But what we believe is going to happen is that we are going to have a tsunami of unlawful detainers and people facing eviction. And I am not debating the fact that when tenants don't pay, the landlord has their own obligations, particularly a mortgage, that have to get paid. But what we're trying to do is set up emergency rental assistance that pays the landlord so the landlord is whole and the tenant stays stably housed. The state has dedicated $20 million of its CARE money to go to this. We, the Partnership for Housing Affordability, very quickly sent out an RFP. We identified ACTS, which is an existing nonprofit. I believe, Andrea, I think you know them well, but I think others of you probably on the call do. They're a nonprofit. Their bread and butter is emergency rental and utility assistance. They will be receiving $450,000 from the state. I reached out to the leadership of Henrico Chesterfield and talked with the mayor yesterday. Henrico, Chesterfield, and the city are all putting $50,000 in the pot, and we hope to raise $500,000 from philanthropy. So very quickly, we will have set up a fund that will probably have about close to $1 million as we get out of the gate. I'll be honest that money will be gone very, very quickly. But we think that that's kind of the need that we're going to see as we move through the summer and into the fall. So what I'm pleased with is that we've been able to react very quickly. Local government is putting money in this pot because they know their participation will enable us to attract private dollars. And everybody understands that this is the emergency that we need to get through. At the beginning of COVID in March and early April, the emergency was to take the folks that were in Camp Kathy, the homeless camp, and get them housed, because you cannot have people on the streets in a camp in the middle of a pandemic. So we got them housed, we got them fed. They continue to be housed in hotels. That's not optimal, but it's better than being on the street. That was our first crisis. We've dealt with that. The next crisis is the evictions. And then when we move through the crisis, all of the housing needs that existed prior to COVID will continue to exist, but be exacerbated. almost 50% of everyone who rents in metropolitan Richmond is paying more than 35% of their monthly gross income. That's how we measure it. We don't measure it on the net, so we know we're underrepresented in this. Almost 50% are paying more than a third of their monthly income for rent and utilities. We know that we have double the number of folks who are more cost burden in terms of their mortgage than just 10 years ago. We know that over 13,000 seniors are living alone and are cost burden. Half of those are severely cost burden, paying more than 50% of their income towards their mortgage or towards their rent. And one of the things I always say to people is, if you're cost burdened and you're 25 years old, you know, you're challenged to pay your rent, you're paying more than 35% of your monthly income on your rent, that's likely temporary. You haven't hit your peak earning years. I always joke and say, if my kids aren't cost burdened at 22 and 25, it means they're living with me, so I'd rather them go be cost burdened someplace else, right? That's temporary. When you're 65, 70, 80 years old and you're paying 50% of your monthly income on housing, that's a permanent situation which impacts your health, your mental health, your emotional health, probably your physical health, because what? You're probably skimping on something else to meet your housing costs. So that's kind of the picture of where we are. I think we are more organized and ready to be responsive to the need than ever before. The need is greater than ever before. One more statistic, rents had gone up 20% in the last 5 years, income's 10%. So part of our challenge isn't that we're not doing much, we are. We're not doing enough in terms of housing production. People aren't earning enough. People don't like to have a conversation about the wage side of this equation, but there are two sides, supply and demand. And then, quite frankly, there's just the economics of housing costs are far outstripping any income gains that we've seen. But again, and it will take hundreds of millions of dollars to address the need. You know, we're having a conversation about equity in our community. We're having a conversation about race. We're having a conversation about equity, about historic inequities. It is going to take hundreds of millions of dollars just to address this on the housing front. And so I am going to be very interested to see if the energy that exists today exists in February when our next mayor introduces a budget, and whether there is a will to address the public housing challenges, the affordable housing challenges in terms of production, and having candid conversations around the policy changes that need to be made, the zoning changes that need to be made, having conversations about density, all of those that allow us to move forward and create a community of opportunity. So with that, I'll draw a breath, have a sip of water, and be happy to take your questions and have a conversation.